Good morning, good afternoon and good evening to this webinar on risk culture with Dr. Simon Ashby. And delighted to say that we have over 2,800 subscribers to the webinar channel and over 300 people attending this current webinar. My name is Philip Allen, I'm the Director of Learning at the Institute of Risk Management, and one of the things that we are continuously facing is that people developing and wanting to understand the ideas, the concepts, the techniques, and also the practical elements of how to build a positive risk culture in their organizations. And time again we are asked at the Institute to go in-house in companies to develop training programs that will facilitate a positive risk culture. And I think it's safe to say that we've certainly helped many organizations across the world do that through academies, through training interventions and learning objectives. And certainly I think that what we're seeing is that we're seeing a number of organizations who really grasp the concepts and the techniques but really struggle with the practical how-to elements. I'm hoping that this webinar is a part of the jigsaw puzzle that will fit into the broader spectrum and give you some tips and techniques that you can take away and apply immediately within your organizations. So over to you, Simon.
Thank you, Philip, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you on the call. Risk culture, I think as Philip says, is one of those topics where we kind of talk about it, and we use the term risk culture increasingly quite freely. But there is still, I think, a lack of an understanding in terms of, what is a potentially positive risk culture, how can we manage our risk cultures effectively. And it's tempting, I think, to see it a bit like the kind of, quest for the Holy Grail. You're forever seeking it, and it's forever out there, the answer to your risk culture questions. But you can never quite touch it. You can never quite, you can never quite get it to understand how to do it effectively. Luckily, I think we're beginning to get to a point now with risk culture, and especially, of course, thanks to the work of people like the Institute of Risk Management, of course, and their paper on risk culture. We're beginning to get to a better understanding, I think, of what it is and how we can manage it effectively. And that's really what I want to talk to you about today. So I suppose the first question is, why risk culture? I mean, why all this sudden interest in it as a subject? Well, of course, many of you, of course, are from financial services, and in the financial crisis, we've seen a lot of people talk about risk culture being at the root of the financial crisis, and that, of course, includes regulators, people including, for example, the Financial Stability Board, highlighting the importance of risk culture as a cause of the financial crisis. We've also, of course, seen more recent events in financial services, such as the Barclays LIBOR scandal, and, of course, subsequent scandals involving other banks on foreign exchange fixing, PPI, and so on. And again there we've seen people highlight the significance of risk culture as a key cause of these events. Indeed, Barclays, of course, you may have seen the Saltz review by Anthony Saltz, and that, of course, explores the causes of the Barclays LIBOR scandal and very much highlights the role that risk culture played in causing that LIBOR scandal. Of course, it's not just confined to financial services. The oil and gas industry, we've had people talk about, of course, safety culture for many years, following, for example, the Piper Alpha disaster. But, of course, we've seen more and more kind of, I suppose, disasters coming out from oil and gas, and the BP Deepwater Horizon is another good example. Of course, the interesting thing about the BP Deepwater Horizon is it didn't necessarily lead to loss of life, although, of course, it affected many people's livelihoods, and perhaps that is an event that falls more into, indeed, the space of risk culture rather than purely safety culture. And, of course, we've seen other events within the UK, for example, health service, where things like the Bristol Royal Infirmary case, where there were tragic deaths of infants, where, again, risk culture has been highlighted as a key cause. So there's no hiding from risk culture, and there's no hiding from the significance of it. Whatever industry you might be in, risk culture is, I think, increasingly seen as a significant cause of major crises and scandals. It is, of course, always difficult to define risk culture, and you will see many different definitions out there. I see no point in spending too much time on this topic, especially seeing as though the IRM, in their paper on risk culture, spend quite a lot of time discussing it and come to, I think, what could be seen as a potentially, useful or hopefully increasingly agreed definition of risk culture. IRM definition, of course, talks about the values, beliefs, knowledge and understanding about risk shared by a group of people with a common purpose, particularly focusing, of course, on the employees of an organisation, and indeed, crucially, as they say, of teams or groups within an organisation as well, and we'll come on to that. And what I want to do now is just to kind of dissect that definition a little bit further so we can get a better understanding of the scope of risk culture and also of the things that can influence your risk culture. And this is, of course, an important starting point in terms of understanding how to assess and manage risk culture in a practical, value-adding way. The first thing to say is, of course, that risk culture doesn't exist in a bubble. Your risk culture doesn't just appear or emerge out of nowhere. It is influenced by many different things within your organisation. It is, of course, influenced by your broader organisational culture, and, of course, you'll already have probably an understanding of the culture of your organisation, having, even having worked in it only for a month or two, you very quickly, I think, get a feel for the culture of all organisations. And those cultures can, of course, affect your own risk culture. For example, is your organisation an aggressive, sales-based kind of organisation? Is it very customer-focused? Is it focused on the public sector? What's the key stakeholder group? Is it customers first? Is it shareholders first? All of those things that are characteristic of your organisational culture can, in turn, very much influence your risk culture. Indeed, in the context of the financial crisis, for example, it was those more aggressive, sales-orientated organisations that seemed to develop the destructive, risk-seeking risk cultures that helped to cause the financial crisis. Then, of course, the individuals within your company and the groups of individuals within your company can in turn influence risk culture. In terms of behaviours, of course, we're not talking necessarily about individual behaviours, we're talking about group behaviours. All people that operate within groups are influenced, of course, by the others in that group, and that can lead to us developing, of course, behaviours, sometimes potentially quite, strange or destructive behaviours, depending on the nature of the group. For example, you may have come across the term groupthink, where groups can become very unresponsive to outside influences and can develop their own kind of destructive strategies and resist challenge from those from the outside. So behaviours can be both group and individual. And of course, though individuals in turn can significantly influence risk culture through their own ethics and their own kind of personal risk attitudes as well, whether they're kind of risk-seeking or whether they are more risk-averse, can in turn go on to influence the risk culture of their organisation, particularly, of course, if we're talking about more senior, more influential people in the organisation. The other thing I think I would to say about this is, of course, people, when they talk about culture, will often use the term behaviours or often talk about attitudes. And I think the IRM's ABC perspective on this is a good way of understanding the relationships between these areas, but also about understanding their differences. Culture and risk culture is not just about behaviours. It's not just about how people behave in an organisation. It can be influenced by many other things. It can be influenced by regulation, for example. It can be influenced by the external market context. Nevertheless, of course, the behaviours of people within an organisation can have a significant influence on its culture. Attitudes, of course, attitudes to risk, attitudes to different stakeholder groups, attitudes to regulation can also in turn influence the culture of an organisation and equally be influenced by the culture of the organisation as well. This, of course, can make it very difficult to really understand, what is culture, what is risk culture. Attitudes and behaviours are things that we can sometimes observe quite easily, but risk culture often it can be much more fundamental than that. It can go into the very deep assumptions that people make about the organisation and about the nature of an organisation. you will often see this in organisations. For example, I've worked in neutral sector organisations and public sector organisations as well as kind of private sector organisations, and kind of deep assumptions in those organisations around profit, around stakeholders, around value, around the mission of the organisation can all be very different, and in turn can have a significant effect on risk culture. So it's a complex area with complex relationships between culture, behaviours, attitudes, and indeed a range of external influences and equally internal influences in the organisation. How your organisation is structured can in turn go on to affect your risk culture. But we'll come on to the management of risk culture in a few minutes. Another key thing I think to stress about risk culture is that risk culture is not just about risk aversion. I think a common misperception about what it means to have a positive or an effective risk culture is that a positive or effective risk culture should be very much a risk-averse one. It should be one that's about prudence. And we have seen some regulators, particularly in financial services, talk about this. Recent work by the PRA and the FCA in the UK, for example, have talked very much about the importance of prudence in relation to an effective risk culture. But a good risk culture, an effective risk culture, is not necessarily a prudent one. It's a one that I think has an appropriate balance between risk and return. And to illustrate this, I'd just like to bring to your attention this concept of the risk culture Coke can. And this was developed out of some research that I did with colleagues at the London School of Economics. And you'll find on the slide the link to our final report that explains this in more detail. Basically what we found is that there are organisations that can perhaps be characterised more towards what you might call the risk-averse spectrum, the total control spectrum. And there are other organisations that might be more towards the total risk spectrum of the Coke can. Lehman Brothers, for example, or BP in the context of Deepwater Horizon might be organisations that you could see more towards the total risk section. And other organisations, perhaps IBM as was, or Kodak Cameras and Kodak Film, could be seen as organisations that were more towards the total control of the end of the spectrum, as might many social enterprises and indeed many mutual organisations as well. Now the key point here is that organisations that are highly risk averse, organisations that are very controlling, are not necessarily strong organisations, do not necessarily have an effective risk culture, because actually they may find that they're not taking enough risk, and as a result of not taking enough risk, they're not generating enough value for their stakeholders, they're not generating enough capital resources, and ultimately they can of course go bankrupt. They effectively fade away because they are not growing, they're not developing enough to remain relevant, or simply they run out of money. So you can have organisations that have overly conservative, overly prudent risk cultures, and this can lead them basically to not take enough risk and therefore not generate enough value, not generate enough money. On the other end of the spectrum, you can of course have organisations that are much more towards the total risk end of the spectrum. These are organisations that very much seek risk, are very much about taking risk. Lehman Brothers is probably the most prime example prior to the financial crisis. These organisations can of course do exceedingly well for short periods of time, but ultimately they are likely to fail, often in quite a catastrophic way because of their arguably excessive risk-taking. So either end of this spectrum is potentially destructive. Of course, the total risk end is the more obvious, the more apparent, but being too conservative can be just as problematic. Now, if you think back to the IRM definition, it talks about not just risk culture in relation to the organisation as a whole, but risk cultures within groups. And a further complication that you can find is that the risk culture in your organisation will rarely be the same across the entire organisation. You will find risk subcultures within your organisation. And it's probably unrealistic to try to force everybody to adopt exactly the same risk culture. Now that's not to say, of course, that there won't be some risk cultures that are perhaps too towards the risk control end of the spectrum, or two towards the risk-taking spectrum for you to accept. But equally, a degree of diversity in your organisation may well be appropriate. It might be, for example, that different parts of the organisation, for example, sales compared to finance, you may expect to see or want to see slight differences in their risk subcultures. Equally, different parts of the business, for example, in financial services, between retail banking and investment banking, again, there it may be appropriate to see differences, albeit perhaps slight differences in risk subculture. In relation to Barclays, arguably, we saw differences that were too great. So you're going to need to accept and need to try and also understand and manage not just your overall risk culture, but also these risk subcultures within your organisation. And we have there, for example, just two example organisations. One, organisation A with very consistent risk subcultures, and the other organisation B with more diverse risk subcultures. And again, there may be a difference between desired levels of difference in risk subcultures and also the kind of what is actual in the organisation. So basically, you may, as an organisation, wish to manage some of those risk subcultures, get them perhaps more towards total control and more towards total risk, depending on how consistent they are with your overall kind of desired risk culture. But you're going to have to manage that diversity, manage that complexity in your organisation. Let's move on to, I think, another popular topic, which is assessing risk culture. Many organisations now are spending time and money trying to assess risk culture. Indeed, my own university has done it. We used, and I won't say who, because I'll be honest with you, it was pretty rubbish, but we used an external consulting organisation to help us assess our risk culture, and they sent out a survey to senior management trying to get a feel for what the risk culture of our organisation was, and whether that risk culture was appropriate, whether it was strong, whether it was effective. And many other organisations, of course, have done the same thing. They may have done it in-house, using their own internal survey tools, or they may have talked to one of the many consulting organisations that now offer risk culture surveys. Of course, all the big consulting companies do, as do many smaller specialist companies as well. And we're seeing increasingly sophisticated techniques and questionnaires and other instruments employed to help assess risk culture. Now, you may be thinking about doing this yourself, and certainly, of course, to spend time and money attempting to assess your risk culture can help, encourage awareness. It can help to get people to accept the concept, see it as something tangible, see it as something real, because it's there, it's out in the ether. It's kind of a virtual concept almost, although it's so powerful in terms of influencing your organisation. And by assessing it, by trying to measure it, we hopefully make it a bit more tangible, a bit more visible, and thus people may accept it more as an issue. So there can be some significant benefits there. It can, of course, allow us as well to be more objective about what our risk culture is and to track how our risk culture changes over time. The only thing that's certain about risk culture is that it will change. Whether you do anything to it or not, your risk culture will change. It will develop over time. And, of course, by assessing it, you can start to see how it's changing. And you can also see how your attempts to manage it may also be changing your risk culture. But there are many problems, many potential pitfalls in terms of assessing risk culture. You will find errors. Any attempt to assess your risk culture will not give you a perfect picture and can indeed lead to a false sense of security. I've seen organisations assess their risk culture not necessarily to find problems, but simply to validate their belief that they've got a strong or good risk culture, and that's not really a good motive for assessing your risk culture. You should be doing it to help you manage, to help you adjust your risk culture over time, just doing it to say, aren't we all good, and give everybody a pat on the back is not really an effective thing to do, especially if, of course, the assessment has got errors in it, because it can very much create, a false sense of security. And, of course, a lot about risk culture is not measurable. And, of course, any attempt to assess your risk culture may not help you very much in terms of the non-measurable side of things, especially if you're relying on surveys. I'd say here a top practical tip in terms of assessing your risk culture is don't just rely on surveys, also do interviews. Interview people in your organisation, get their views on your organisation's risk culture. If possible, get in expert interviewers, people that have got a degree of, either academic training or anthropological training, people that kind of are human scientists, if you like, and that can help you conduct those interviews in a robust way. Most consultants don't have those skills, I should add. And of course, there's a real danger that you just try and, I suppose, mechanise the management of your risk culture. You can get on this kind of treadmill of assessing and managing your risk culture, where the reality is that your risk culture may actually be very different to that which you have assessed. And for me, this picture illustrates it all. This is actually a picture of the New York skyline prior to 11th of September 2001. And those buildings in the sort of foreground are, in fact, the Twin Towers. Although you probably wouldn't realise that, you probably wouldn't see that in terms of the picture. What we have here, of course, is a representation of reality. There's a lot of detail missing, and we may indeed make false inferences about this picture. What we know now to be two buildings, we see as potentially one building. And the other buildings as well, we haven't got enough detail really to assess and understand what they are appropriately. And this is basically an illustration of what a risk culture assessment, a pictorial assessment of what a risk culture assessment can look like. You're not going to get a full high definition picture with any assessment of your risk culture. You're going to get a low resolution, half a megapixel, 1 megapixel picture, of your organisation's risk culture. So it's not going to give you that kind of complete clarity that you might like. So by all means, please do, and I think there is significant value in assessing your risk culture, but never think that you're going to get a full, clear picture of your risk culture. There will be much that is hidden. There will be much that you have missed. That said, there are, I think, some interesting tools now coming into use in terms of assessing risk culture. One that I've seen that I find very interesting comes from Macquarie University in Australia. There's somebody there called Elizabeth Sheedy who has developed a very interesting risk culture assessment tool. So please do look out for that. I expect if you Google Elizabeth Sheedy, you should find that tool quite easily. She is an experienced psychologist and has developed a much more robust tool than I think many that we see in this area. There's also the Barrett Value surveys that you can sometimes come across. These Barrett Value surveys basically check alignment between individual values and the corporate values of an organisation. And you can repeat those surveys over a number of years to see how people's individual values are either aligned with or diverge from corporate values. And this, again, is, I think, another interesting and potentially more robust technique than some of the surveys that we've seen developed by consultants. Often these surveys have been developed really rather quickly, and I think it would be really good to see a rather more robustness and rigour in some of those surveys going forward. I want to now sort of finally turn to managing risk culture and just look at some of the things that you can do to have a positive effect on your risk culture. And to structure this, I take the 10 elements of success taken from the IRM's work. Another shameless plug, I'm afraid. But I think actually when you compare this, or certainly when I compare this to my own research, when I compare this to other literature in the area, for example, work by the Financial Stability Board on the elements of an effective, risk culture, we are actually beginning to see quite a lot of consensus here. While we may find some differences in organisations in terms of how these things are done, and while there may be some other things, I'm not saying that this is an exhaustive, list, but certainly I think there's an emerging consensus that these are important areas. So if you want to start having a positive effect on managing your risk culture, then these are a very good starting point. The first one is probably the one that's most obvious and most apparent and gets talked about a lot in relation to risk culture. And that, of course, is tone from the top. And if you look down at the bottom of the slide, you'll see two photographs. One is a photograph of Dick Fold, Richard Fold, who was chief executive of Lehman Brothers, and the other is a photograph of Warren Buffett. If you Google these two individuals, you will find some excellent YouTube clips that kind of, I think, very much highlight the tone from the top that they exhibited. Dick Fold very much typified the kind of aggressive management style that we came to expect, I think, in many investment banks and in financial services more widely. And he was very much focused on sales, very much focused on the bottom line, and could use some very aggressive language at times, both publicly and, of course, privately. Other examples, of course, include people like Fred Goodwin. A slightly different tone from the top, but equally negative, perhaps, could be Tony Hayward from BP, for example, who, of course, in relation to the Deepwater Horizon case, showed, at least initially, almost a complete lack of concern for what was going on, and, of course, received a lot of negative publicity as a result. And then if we contrast that to somebody like Warren Buffett, who, of course, is a very successful businessman, one of the richest people in the world, but, he very much supports, risk-taking. He's about taking risk. He supports risk-taking in his organisation. But he also recognises that risk needs to be managed appropriate. That risk needs to be managed sensibly. And he's talked in the past that, he is the chief risk officer. He's there to take risk, but crucially to take appropriate risk. So the message there is very much about considered risk-taking that balances risk and return. A very different tone from the top. He comes across as your kind of, I suppose, the grandfather, that you either had or you never had. And it, I think, encourages a very different kind of management response in his organisation. Ethics and stakeholders, again, we can see this in organisations, some of whom, of course, very much emphasise ethical values, very much emphasise the importance of stakeholders. I do work with a social housing organisation that very much exemplifies, I think, this kind of ethical stakeholder-focused approach. The whole focus of the organisation is on customers and delivering value to customers and to delivering affordable rents and quality housing. And it very much informs and affects the whole culture, and including the risk culture of the organisation, which again is aimed at ensuring that customers have the best possible experience that they can, and that the organisation is managed so that it's around for the long term, so that value can be delivered over a significant time horizon. Staff, of course, can always be a challenge. Risk is something that can be overlooked, or of course it can be something that people see as an annoyance, especially, of course, when time and effort has to be spent managing it. I spent myself frustrating half an hour or so on Friday trying to do a display screen assessment, risk assessment in my own organisation. So even those of us that are experienced professionals can sometimes have difficulty accepting the importance of managing risk, or at least managing some risks. So it's important, of course, to get those messages across and to ensure that staff do see and are aware of, how important managing risk is and understand the benefits of managing risk for the organisation and for its stakeholders. Risk information flows are a perennial issue in organisations. What information is reported to whom and how is it reported? Is it reported in a clear way? What's the nature of that reporting? All of these things can influence risk culture. I think the key thing is to have clear and unambiguous information flows. And also information flows that go both up and down the organisation, especially from the risk function. Those of you involved in risk management, ask yourselves, how often do you talk to the rest of your organisation? How often do you talk to people in your business? The likelihood is it will probably be quite often, but how often is that communication initiated by you? And how often is it initiated by other people in your organisation? So how often do people pick the phone up to you to say, for example, they've got a problem? A lot of the time as risk managers, we're talking to people, we're trying to gather information from them, or we're trying to understand how they're assessing risk, and it's rare that they actually pick the phone up to us. And of course, in organisations where we do get that two-way communication, we can have, of course, a much quicker spotting of potential problems, and the risk management function can get in much earlier to help avoid, potentially catastrophic situations. Willingness to learn from mistakes is, of course, again, an issue we've seen in many organisations. It amazes me, actually, how often organisations have near misses or have loss events and then completely fail to learn from those loss events. Actually, I remember a colleague, some of you may remember him, Professor, I should say he's not dead, he's still very much alive, Professor Brian Toft, who did a very interesting PhD on this subject, on organisational learning from disasters. And indeed, there's been much research on this. And it's amazing, really, what seems to prevent organisations from learning, even from events that have affected themselves. And equally, of course, and even more resistance to learning from events that have affected other people. I think there's a tendency to think that lightning can't strike twice, or that it won't happen to us because we're different. Without people, perhaps accepting that things can and do go wrong, and that there's a need to learn from past mistakes to ensure that they're not repeated. Now, number 6 is an interesting one. It's certainly important to avoid over-complexity, but that doesn't need to say that organisations necessarily should strive to be simple. Business and indeed social enterprise and public sector, all of these things are complicated activities. But of course, where they are made over-complicated, then that's where you have the problem. So don't please perceive this as being to simplify everything. This is not what this element is saying. It's saying avoid over-complexity. Of course, if you do have over-complexity, complicated processes, complicated organisational structures, then there is always a danger that risk can hide out in those complex processes or structures or systems. I've very much seen that in my own organisation, and I'm sure you've seen that in your organisations too. The important thing is that, we must avoid those kind of hidden risks, those things that we miss in overly complicated organisations. But that certainly doesn't mean to say that you should try and simplify everything, because, of course, business is complex, and we shouldn't oversimplify, because that can cause just as many problems as over-complexity. The whole, for example, within financial services, the whole focus on risk models, for example, VAR modelling. Now, it may seem complicated to you, but the reality is that a lot of that modelling is actually trying to simplify risk, simplify the management of risk. And actually, sometimes I think it can oversimplify it. You can't reduce risk down to one single number. It just doesn't work like that. Behaviours. Now, again, number 7, don't see this just as incentives. Incentives can be an element here to this, in terms of obviously rewarding or encouraging behaviours through financial incentive schemes or through promotion. Having, of course, schemes that are linked both to risk management goals as well as sales goals or growth goals can be very important. But this isn't just about those kind of financial, tangible incentives. It can also be about how people challenge in the organisation and how people respond to inappropriate behaviour. I mean, we saw this very much, I think, with Barclays. I mean, in terms of the libel scandal, there was bad behaviour there quite clearly, and that bad behaviour was not challenged. And you can see it again in other organisations where we see bad behaviour that is simply not challenged by people in the organisation. Now, sometimes that depends on how the organisation is structured. I mean, partnership-type organisations like John Lewis, you can see much more effective challenge there because, of course, the employees all have a stake in the organisation. But even in non-partnership organisations, you can, again, see organisations that have managed to create a situation where staff are encouraged to challenge the status quo. Top management are open to constructive feedback, and also where people in the organisation generally are prepared to speak out if they see things that aren't right. And this isn't just about kind of mechanical whistleblowing lines, although they can play a part. It's also about stressing to employees that it's okay to speak out, it's okay to challenge, where appropriate, and that may be through training, it may be through awareness, it may be through also linked to things like tone from the top, what top management say and how they encourage challenge in their organisations. Now, point 8 is also a very important one around the value that's assigned to the risk function and the value that's assigned to risk professionals more generally. I think there's still a tendency in some organisations to see risk management as a bit of a kind of cul-de-sac. The people in risk management are somehow different. They're a bit more like audit, or they're more like kind of the police in the organisation. They're there to prevent things from happening. They're basically there to say no, and they wander around with clipboards or whatever. And of course, as we all know, this is not a constructive or healthy attitude towards risk professionals. But here, of course, it's beholden on the risk function itself to get the right message across. And I think as risk professionals, we've got to show that we are here to add value to our organisations. We're here to help our organisations achieve their financial and strategic and growth objectives. We're not here to constantly try and slow the organisation down and put the brakes on the organisation. We're actually there to help make the organisation go faster. We're there to help the organisation take the right risks and develop an appropriate balance between risk and return. And I think we've got to think about how we work with people in organisations and not see ourselves simply as an oversight function, somebody to come in and say when things are wrong. Rather, we need to see ourselves as business partners working, with the business, helping them at an early stage to develop new products or new processes, to implement new controls, or even to remove unnecessary overbearing controls. We constantly have to get that message across, and I think also retain stories, retain cases of where we have helped to add value to the organisation, so that we can show that to people, including top management, so that they can understand and appreciate the value of risk functions. Number 9, obviously, again, is about challenging the status quo in organisations, and this comes back to my earlier point on groupthink, where, of course, you get organisations full of very similar people, almost sort of clones, whether that be racially, ethnically, in terms of gender, or indeed in many other ways, culturally, socially. You can once again see problems in organisations because you have insufficient diversity to encourage effective decision making, to encourage effective challenge. I've sat on various boards over the years, and the ones that work best are the ones that have, for example, people from a wider range of social, religious, and also national backgrounds, from different racial backgrounds, and obviously also a good balance between men and women on those boards as well. and that can very much foster a far more appropriate risk culture where you've got the good of kind of all of those, those different kind of stereotypes, but also hopefully, less of the bad as well. So this, I think, is a key point to encourage, again, find ways to encourage the status quo and linked to diversity and discrimination as well. Through diversity we have strengths, particularly because people are more likely to challenge the status quo. And finally, the link between, of course, risk culture and HR. I don't know how many of you today, or I can't remember how many of you today are from an HR background. But of course, there is a very close link between risk culture and human resource management professionals. They can very much help us to control and to manage our risk culture through the HR strategy, through HR policies, recruitment policies, and so on. So if you're a risk manager working in the area of risk culture and you haven't done so yet, spend time with relevant HR professionals. Get their input, because I think you will find that key to success. Okay, so that I think is nearly very enough from me, and I know that there'll be, or I hope that there will be, plenty of questions. Risk culture, as I said, is something that can be hard to define and manage, and it is something that I think has been ignored for many years. But it's certainly not just for tree-hugging hippies. It's not just for sociologists and psychologists or academics or kind of weird people in the corners of your organisation. It's a very real thing, risk culture, in your organisation, and it has as much, if not more, influence than all those tangible policies and procedures and structures that you have in your organisation. It doesn't matter how good all of that kind of tangible physical stuff is. If your risk culture is rotten, then you're going to have a problem. You can monitor and manage your risk culture, but it is as much an art as it is a science. And please do remember that mechanistic management of your risk culture is not something that is going to work effectively. You need to understand that it's a complex, very human, thing, risk culture, and it requires complex, human-orientated responses. But increasingly, there's sound practice, and I encourage you to have a look at the IRM's work in the area. But there's much other good sound practice out there as well, from people like the Financial Stability Board. Even if you're not working in financial services, that is a very helpful source of information on risk culture. And indeed, now the beginnings of some academic research as well, including, as I said, my own work in the area. So I think that's probably enough for me now in terms of talking. So please, any questions?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Adam Brooke. I'm here in the London Training Centre, coordinating this. Thank you very much to Simon, obviously delivering the webinar. Now we're going to be opening the floor up to some questions. Now you can ask questions by it's the top left-hand button. There's Ask a Question. If you type out your questions, we've already received a few. But before we ask any of those, Simon, if you remember, we sent an email out to all yesterday, everyone who registered for this webinar, to ask if you did have any questions in advance. And the responses were quite high, but one that sort of stuck out, and a few others that we'll answer today, was from the lady in the NHS. So the questions from the top, do you want me to just read them out and then you can answer each, or do you want me to read them all, Simon?
Please do. Yeah, read them out individually, Adam.
Okay, so the first question was, how can you change the risk culture of an organisation?
Well, that's the $6 million question. I think the first thing you've got to start by doing is to understand what it is now. Yes, I think assessment is necessary, but also, a close investigation within your organisation in terms of what is your risk culture, what are the defining characteristics of your risk culture. And, you will already know that working within an organisation. You'll probably already have a good idea. And you've got to certainly, I think, complement gut feel, and gut feel is important here, with also some attempts to assess your risk culture using surveys and interviews, for example. Once you've got that, of course, you've got to start to think, well, what is it that I want to change? What is it that I don't like about my risk culture? And what I will say here is that there's no one ideal cultural stereotype, and what's right for your organisation at one period of time may be different at another period of time. But equally, I think you will find there will be things that almost certainly you want to change. And then, of course, you've got to move on to, well, how am I going to change these things? What are the different levers can I use to help manage my risk culture? And of course, I very much use that term lever carefully, because it's a constant, to some extent, it's a constant balancing act. It's a constant manipulation of your risk culture. It's not something you can do just as a project. Let's have a project, let's implement a new risk culture, job done, we'll move on. Risk culture's constantly changing, constantly evolving, so it's very much about kind of subtle adjustments over an extended period of time. But things that you can use there, training, I think, can be a very powerful way of trying to control and manage your risk culture. So how you develop training, for example, the nature of that training, the content of that training. Do you have very process-orientated risk management training, or is it also aimed at influencing people's hearts and minds, aimed at encouraging people to understand the benefits of risk management? Tone from the top is also very important. If your top management aren't kind of supportive of where you want to go in terms of risk culture and aren't engaging in it, then you're going to have a significant problem. But of course there are many other things. Risk appetite, there's a close link between risk appetite and risk culture as well. So what you might be saying in terms of risk appetite statements, or in terms of the kind of the limits that you set around risk, will equally influence risk culture. And finally, of course, things like your values, your ethics, ethical codes and incentive arrangements are also things that can often quite significantly change your risk culture. I hope that answers the question. It's a very broad question, so it's difficult to give a very precise answer, but thank you for that question. It's of course a really key one for so many people.
Okay, Simon, I hope that answers the next question, and the questions are now flooding in, so we're going to be around for as long as Simon can be, until he decides to go. The next question is, how and when should you communicate your risk culture to senior management and or directors?
I think always. I mean, really they should obviously have a feel for it already, but it should be a kind of a regular thing, a regular exercise. At the very least, I think, boards should be thinking about, formally thinking about risk culture on an annual basis, if not more frequently. And if you've got a risk committee, then it's something that should be a regular topic of discussion. So, really as often as possible, but of course, don't be too mechanistic about it. Highlight obviously areas of concern or areas of weakness that might have been identified on an exception basis, but also consider a kind of perhaps an annual exercise to kind of more formally assess and investigate your risk culture.
And the third question, and the questions are flooding in. If we do run out of time, we'll get to them anyway after the webinar finishes. But the third question on this one is, Simon, what is the best way to communicate risk culture in a simple and straightforward format that senior management will take value from? I think you answered it in the last question. Yeah,
I mean, there's various ways that you can do it. I mean, obviously, I'd encourage people to look at the IRM's work on this. There's the IRM risk culture aspects model, for example, that highlights a number of different elements, of risk culture. So, that would be a good starting point. I also mentioned the work of Elizabeth Sheedy, and as I say, they have a very interesting risk culture assessment tool that again provides quite, I think, a clear and simple, but also very rich and effective way to communicate risk culture. And so I think there's various frameworks out there, but pick one that that is right for you and your organisation.
You actually mentioned that one of the questions, Simon, was what was the name of the author for that? What was the name of that author again?
Elizabeth Sheedy. It's S-H-E-E-D-Y, I believe. So if people Google Elizabeth Sheedy and risk culture, then I think it will come up. I can't off the top of my head remember, because I know she set up a little company, but it's research that's out of Macquarie University in Australia.
Brilliant. There's been some questions about, obviously, how can you attend some training, which is funny why they asked that, Simon. Simon's actually one of our trainers here at the IRM, and he is delivering a training course, but we'll get onto that later. Let's just do the questions for now. The next question is, let's see, what is the best way to get engagement from the rest on the business on risk culture? As you've previously said, risk management can be seen as the police of the business.
I think for me the key message is to stress to people that risk culture is not about simply being prudent. It's also about taking risk, and it's about understanding when to take risk and when not to take risk. Appropriate, sustainable risk taking is a characteristic of an effective risk culture. So I think get those messages across. Stress to people, this isn't an exercise in making the organisation more conservative or in holding the organisation back. This is an exercise in helping the organisation to achieve its business objectives.
Brilliant. And I think there's just two more. And now that I've said that, a whole flood of comes flying through. Okay, so what are the practical steps that can be taken to entrench a risk culture in the organisation, especially the board of directors and senior management staff? And then this person continues with, which specific trainings can I suggest to my management to attend to improve the risk culture as well as other staff members? I'll leave that one to you, Simon.
Yeah. So, well, in terms of training, I think it's about getting the right messages across to people around risk and around the management of risk. So I think stressing that risk management is not just about control. It's about taking appropriate risk. It's also about I think stressing to them as well how significant their behaviour is and their tone is in terms of influencing risk culture. One powerful thing to do actually, and I've experienced this myself, is to look at cases of similar organisations to yours. So in almost every sector, I mentioned the various sectors today, but in almost every sector you will find some powerful case studies of organisations that have failed spectacularly as a result of significant weaknesses in their risk culture. Show those to people at the top. Say, this could be us. How are we different? Why are we different? And I think that can really, highlight how significant risk culture can be, and hopefully help them, help to encourage buy-in. It's not here about being a doom monger. It's about obviously ensuring that your organisation is sustainable into the long term.
And the last question that we've got, Simon, how do you see the nexus between risk appetite and risk culture?
Yes, an excellent question. I mean, these are very closely related subjects. Both risk culture and risk appetite are about risk taking and about the control of risk, so it's about balancing risk and return. I would see your risk appetite as, I suppose, the physical, the tangible manifestation of that. So you're probably going to have a formal risk appetite statement where you outline your kind of attitude and approach to risk, and you're probably going to have a variety of kind of risk limits in place as well. And now that's tangible. Everybody can see that. And your risk appetite, of course, is the intangible side of it. That what people assume about risk taking and control, what they see as appropriate and what they see as not appropriate. So the two things are very much complementary. You can get problems, and I've seen this in organisations where they suddenly change their risk appetite very much away from their risk culture. And perhaps they have a culture of being a safe, fairly conservative, fairly kind of long-term view organisation, and then people come in that try and encourage more aggressive risk-taking and more of a sales orientation, and you can get real problems then, real conflict between the risk culture and risk appetite. So that, they're very closely related, and if your risk appetite starts to move away from your risk culture, then you can have significant problems in organisations.
Okay, well, listen guys, it's been great to have you all. As Simon was answering that question, I've clicked onto the last slide, which is to let you all know that if you enjoyed this webinar, Simon is actually delivering a course on this topic on the 30th of April. And we can tell who's obviously attended live, and I'll be emailing each of you just to let you know a little bit more about the course. Just to give you some more idea about the webinar itself, you'll see that there's an attachments button at the top of the screen. If you click on that, this presentation will be ready for you to download, as well as various course brochures, including the course brochure on Simon's Risk Culture course. And on the right of the screen, you'll see the future webinars which are coming up. So please feel free to attend those, and we look forward to welcoming you. I do have one question I'd like to ask you all before you all decide to leave, which is, which one of these courses would you like to have further information on? The IRM deliver these courses here at our premises here in London. So if you can just indicate on the screen, it should be popping up in front of your PowerPoint presentation, which one of those courses you'd like to attend. Clearly Risk Culture is A, so that's the first one, which is Simon's Business Risk and Resilience Root Cause Analysis, Running Effective Risk Workshops, which is also a webinar which we've delivered, and Human Factors and Risk Management, which is also a webinar which we have delivered. If you guys have any other questions, I know that perhaps you do have some more. Please feel free to send them in, and I'll get Simon to reply to you. And this is a fantastic chance. So thank you very much, Simon. Simon?
Thank you, everybody, and well, enjoy the rest of the day. Hopefully it's sunny wherever you are. Brilliant.
And I hope to see you all on the next webinar, which is on the 21st of April. Thanks again, and if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. And that's goodbye. Simon?
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.